think I can get this right. It's always moving, isn't it? It's down here, isn't it? The thing I need. Perfect. It's not displaying the. It's gone funny again. It will do, will it? After a minute. Okay. Well, I can start talking. I don't think we live in a particularly auspicious. What does searching for source mean? Is it really that bad? That's looking fairly doom-laden to me. Searching for source. No, hang on. It's getting excited again, roughly speaking. And we're there. Fantastic. Okay. I think we're not living in a fantastic age for the understanding and appreciation of brands. And I think one of the reasons for this is that nearly everybody in business at the moment is effectively in a competition to try and appear as scientific as possible. And when people in business try and look scientific, what they generally draw inspiration from is sciences like engineering or physics. If you look at it, economics is a ridiculous attempt to create equivalent laws to the laws of physics and to apply them to human behavior, which fairly obviously is inordinately more complex. I mean, lots and lots of people, including economists, have actually spotted this. Essentially, if atoms had individual agency, imagine how difficult physics would be. And one of the central approaches in trying to be scientific, when you borrow from, say, economics, there's no such thing as a free lunch, or you borrow from physics, which is essentially Newton's laws of thermodynamics, you tend to very quickly come to the assumption that nothing can be created or destroyed. And my argument is that brands actually are a form of alchemy, in that you can create value out of nothing except meaning. You don't need to consume resources. You could even make a very strong environmental case for brands, in that when people pay for intangible value, they're buying meaning which doesn't require any atoms or carbon-intensive activities in its creation. That's an extreme view, but nonetheless, when people are paying for meaning, when people are paying for intangible things, you are, in a sense, performing a form of alchemy. You're making something much more valuable than it was in a really special and magical process. Now, economists fundamentally hate advertising because the standard school of economics, essentially, it attempts to achieve this kind of physics-style certainty by making some enormous and insane assumptions about how people really make decisions. So everybody who's got an MBA, everybody who's done kind of Economics 101 as part of an MBA course, has been polluted by this economic idea that every decision, this is what happens in economic models, by the way, every decision takes place in an atmosphere of perfect information and perfect trust. And so if you believed that, of course, in such a world, marketing and advertising wouldn't need to exist. Everybody would know exactly what they wanted, how much they were prepared to pay for it, and they would trust implicitly and completely the person who was delivering it or selling it to them. Now, it's an utterly ridiculous assumption, patently, because in the real world those conditions really exist somewhere between very, very rarely and never, and it's closer to never. It's even more ridiculous when you think about it in the context of evolutionary psychology, because patently our brains haven't evolved to operate under such conditions. I mean, if you think about it, if you were naively trusting and assumed that everything you knew was all there was to know, and you went about your life on the savannah, or for that matter in the 21st century, you'd very rapidly end up conned, destitute, and dead. It's not a great ingredient for any human being to be spectacularly trusting, for example. So we've patently evolved mental mechanisms which are optimized to operating under conditions where, surprise, surprise, people may be lying to us. By the way, even bees have evolved these mechanisms, where you spot what is a reliable signal and what isn't. Now, there is a small school of economics, the Austrian school, which is characterized by people like Schumpeter, for example, von Mises, Hayek. And they had a very, very different approach to economics. First of all, they can't get a job in an economics faculty because they refuse to use maths. And their argument is the idea that you can attach a mathematical level sort of number to utility when preference is ordinal, they believe, not cardinal, is just a rubbish. So that, as far as they're concerned, more or less kiboshes maths from the get-go. But they were very interesting in that they believed essentially, they created, von Mises in particular in his book On Human Action, created what was really the forerunner of behavioural science and behavioural economics. They called it praxeology, which was the kind of study of decision-making and action on the part of individual human agents. And they believed that economics properly pursued was the study of praxeology under conditions of scarcity. In other words, this is what people do when forced to partition up a scarce resource. And it's very interesting because they get no credit for this. But when you think about it, it is blindingly obvious that economics as a discipline should be subordinate to psychology. The idea that you can create a kind of economics discipline, just as in a sense, you have a sort of hierarchy of sciences which goes maths, kind of physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, and then you put economics at the end. Okay? The idea that you make this glorious leap and try and create an economic theory which is based on maths doesn't really make sense. And so praxeology is very interesting and actually very much ahead of its time. And it was one of the interesting products of the Austrian School of Economics is they completely and very properly understood the important role of advertising and marketing because they understood that nothing had an intrinsic value independent of context and independent of human perception. That whether something was good or bad was not a product of what it is, which is a model of the perfect information world. It was a product of how we perceived it, what we compared it to, how we viewed it, and what other options were available to us at the time. So in a way, when Don Draper said, what's great marketing in my view is 199, he's not being completely crazy. The most simple piece of marketing, by the way, is simply to compare price in a different or unusual way. And I've got a few examples of this, but I practiced it in my own life. For years, I couldn't get my father to get any kind of pay television, which is crazy because he's the kind of guy who, frankly, Discovery Wings is, or Nazi megastructures is pretty much the highest form of entertainment in his life. So even when I offered to pay for him to have pay television, he thought it was all far too expensive, grumbling on about how it's £19 a month. And he wouldn't listen. And then I said, okay, let's change the comparative set. So I said, well, it isn't really £19 a month. It's £19 a month. It's more like £1, maybe, no. It's more like 60p a day or 70p a day. I said, you already spend £2 a day on newspapers. And within a second, he said, oh, I suppose you're right. And suddenly he went and got this guy and has now become something of an evangelist. So, contrary to what economists think, to an economist there is no difference between 70p a day and £17 a month. I probably got the math slightly wrong there, but you get my drift, okay? To a human being there is. Because whether something's good value or not entirely depends on what you compare it to. Just a few interesting experiments. If you ever feel guilty buying really, really expensive tea, which I do, okay, you go in and you see this fancy monkey-picked Darjeeling. You think, shit, that's monstrously expensive compared to PG Tips. I can't possibly pay for that, okay? Do a little calculus, which is very simple, by the way, which is if you buy that tea and you take it home and you make it with tap water, it's cheaper as a drink than bottled water is. And you don't feel guilty buying bottled water. So actually our perception of price. Now the wonderful thing about the Austrians is they understood all this stuff. And this, by the way, is a von Mises quote from On Human Action, which I discovered trawling through. It's kind of like all books translated from German. It's not an easy read, if you get my drift. But by the man who sweeps the floor in this analogy, he explicitly means, in fact he goes on to say, he means marketing and advertising. That there is the thing and there is the context in which we consume the thing, and value as a product of both of them combined. And in fact, there is no sensible distinction to be made between one or the other. Now, what I think has happened, and I think there are a large number of business cultures which would much rather improve the food than sweep the floor. In other words, they'd much rather try and make the product better, or drop the price of the product, or drop the price at which the product can be manufactured, than change the appreciation of the food and the amount people are prepared to pay by changing the context in which it's consumed. If you think about it, if you went to a restaurant where there was it served Michelin-starred quality food, let's say, but there was a smell of sewage that pervaded the whole restaurant. And when you picked up your fork, all the little tines were slightly out of alignment, okay? You'd have a shit time, okay? Doesn't matter how good the food is, you wouldn't really enjoy it. And in the same way, if you have a great product, but it's branded terribly, by which I mean the context in which you have to consume it is rubbish, it's a rubbish product. And I think we make it, and I think it's a really, really important analogy makes it. But what a lot of companies, Silicon Valley is obsessed with the idea that you must win through product superiority and no marketing. What we also find in the advertising and marketing industries, which is why I say it's not a great day to be in advertising and marketing in some senses, is when I came into the business in about 1988, the majority of advertising budgets were for packaged goods. The kind of things you see in this museum for the most part. Procter & Gamble, Unilever, beer, cigarettes, back then, cigars, detergents, etc. Now, those companies which advertised those products had a fairly good appreciation of the importance of brand. And in fact, the chief executive had probably done a 4-year stint in marketing. Now, if you look at ad spend now, that isn't 2/3 of ad spend anymore, it's less than a third, more like a quarter. What's taken up the slack has been things like mobile handsets, mobile phone networks, home broadband, insurance comparison websites, finance companies. And all those companies have an inordinately more an engineering or financial culture than they do a marketing culture. And to many of those companies, they kind of despise marketing. In fact, they see it as essentially reprographics with A-levels, I think. I don't think they see it as having a strategic role in business decision making. And I think that's fundamentally problematic, because I think we've really got to work 3 times as hard now for people to understand that actually how you sweep the floor matters as much as the restaurant. Now, a brilliant example of trying to improve the food in a restaurant that stinks happened about, my guess is it's the late 90s. I can remember it because we were partially involved. Royal Mail decided that to improve their postal service in the UK, they wanted 99%, let me get this right, 99% of first-class mail to arrive the next day by 8 a.m. Okay? And the effort to achieve that logistically, rather like saying we're going to make the food better, the effort to achieve that logistically practically broke the organisation, and they sensibly gave up because it was stupid, right? Now let me explain why it was stupid. You go, well, it's making it a better product. Well, one, how is anybody going to flaming notice? Because we don't generally drive around Britain every day posting 100 letters to ourselves and measure how many have arrived the next day. Most letters that don't arrive the next day not because it was a Royal Mail failing, but because the bastard who posted the check to you is lying. Okay? Oh no, it's lost in the post. Oh, post's terrible around here, right? So you'll still end up with a load of lying bastards claiming they, which will pollute your perception. But then Royal Mail sensibly said, well, hold on a second. If we ask the punter, at the time, I think, let me get this right, it was something like 95% or 96 or 90% of first-class mail arrived the next day. When they ask consumers what percentage of first-class mail arrived the next day, the answers varied between, I think, 30 and 70%, maybe 80% at the highest. No one was higher than 80, basically, okay, apart from real postal nerds. So, now think about this, okay? Given that you pay for, when you buy a first-class stamp, you're not buying the statistical probability your letter will arrive the next day, you're buying your belief that it will. If the perception's much worse than the reality, don't improve the reality, at least not first, improve the perception. And so they sensibly decided, rather than making themselves better, they decided to tell people how good they were. And then they went even better, really, because you could have quoted a load of statistics of people and burbled on about 98%. But they conveyed that message in what you might call a system one, what Daniel Kahneman would call a system one way of conveying the message. They discovered that the British Postal Service, still is actually, is better than the German postal service. And they said that. Now, there was a lot of Germans going, yes, we have won the World Cup more times, but your postal service is better. Now, if you're a Brit, this is a fair generalisation, I think. If you're a Brit, if we're doing anything better than the Germans, then it's patently good enough. In fact, if anything, we probably should slacken off a bit. We're in danger of getting a bit anally retentive about this stuff, okay? If you actually said it's better than the Germans, okay, that is steady, throttle back a bit, okay? And it was a very brilliant thing to do, because it actually made the first-class stamp inordinately more valuable without changing anything. And there is loads and loads of alchemy about this. By the way, the other fascinating fact we discovered that the single largest determinant over whether people liked Royal Mail or not, after all this brand advertising activity, actually boiled down to whether you liked your postman. So the next thing after doing this advertising campaign was probably to do a charm offensive with postmen, to be honest. It might have been the most effective thing to do. And to be absolutely honest, of course, we all know this in real life, don't we? Actually, if you like someone, you put up with quite shit service from them. I mean, we shouldn't forget this. But it's true in life, isn't it? We've all known people who have basically kept on in employment because it's a great bloke. And, so it's perfectly reasonable. You can make things better by sweeping the floor rather than improving the food. And I think we made a terrible, terrible mistake as marketers. And I gave this talk. We used the phrase added value, right? Now, I gave this talk and realised that actually the company that was sponsoring the event at which I was speaking was called Added Value. So it wasn't perhaps the most diplomatic point at which to launch this idea. But it's not added. Added suggests that the food's just as good as it's always going to be. And if you add marketing, you can add a few magic sprinkles and a little bit of fairy dust, which makes it a tiny bit better. But the basic quality of the food determines value, and then marketing can add a bit. It makes it like one of those optional extras in your car, like heated steering wheel. Yeah, you could have that if you wanted to, but frankly, I wouldn't bother, Okay, I did end up with a heated steering wheel. So the great thing about buying a car second-hand, by the way, is you never have to justify any of the extras. Of course I didn't want a heated steering wheel, but it was on the car when I bought it. But anyway, I don't think it's added value at all. I don't think it's product plus or minus brand. I think it's product times brand. If you've got a great product and no brand, you've got zero. You might as well have nothing. If you haven't got trust, if you haven't got basic perceptual strengths, if you haven't presented it in the right way, you haven't compared it in the right way, you could end up with zero. Just the wrong name can destroy billions of dollars of value. Anybody here, I always do this when I go off on one, anybody here got a Philips air fryer? Or any kind of air fryer? Yeah. Do you think it's one of the best things you've ever bought?
I've never used it.
You've never used it?
I have it, but I've not used it.
Oh.
I've had it for months and months and months.
Okay, no, do definitely, because it's actually brilliant, okay? But the strange thing is, if you go to Asia, loads and loads of people own these things. Why? Because fryer means basically cooking, because in Asia you don't have an oven, you fry things, okay? So air fryer means air cooker, and they look at it, ooh, that's really exciting. So they walk off the shelves in the East. In the West, where fryer means an unhealthy form of cooking, it dominates. And so if you go into John Lewis, the air fryers are all next to the deep fat fryers. Likewise, people go, well, we don't really fry food, do we, dear? Maybe we might saute something, or occasionally, we might flash fry something, but we're not really into that sort of Glaswegian, So the fascinating thing there is that it's really difficult to sell in the UK simply because of one word. And it's a brilliant. I gave this talk once. Someone came up to me afterwards and said they made one mistake. Said they should have just named it in French and called it the air sauteurs, and then everybody would have wandered into John Lewis checkbooks at the Reddings. Do you remember that thing sous vide? As far as I can remember, sous vide cooking, which sounded like a flaming bloody health risk to me. It meant putting food in a Sainsbury's bag and then walking around with it in your underpants on a fairly hot day for about 8 hours as a form of cooking. Now, because it was French, okay, everyone thought, oh, I've really got to get into sous vide. If they called it walking around in your underpants cooking, they wouldn't have got anywhere, right? And so what you call something, just those tiny little contextual things, can take you from hero to zero, just by moving from one comparative set to another, or by being mentally pigeonholed in one place rather than another. I also go further. Now, interestingly, some of you who are fans of Peter Drucker, Drucker comes effectively, great marketing writer, comes actually from the Austrian School of Economics. His dad was best mates with Schumpeter. And Drucker remarkably said, he said, there are only two valuable things a company does. There's marketing and there's innovation. Everything else is a cost. The only two things that create value are marketing and innovation. Very weird thing to say. In a way, though, I've got to say that actually I go further and say that marketing and R&D, or M and R&D, marketing and innovation are actually the same thing. And they probably should be part of the same process. Now you're going to say, what on earth are you talking about? Let me explain. Okay, there are two ways you can basically create economic value. You can either find out what people want and work out a really clever way to make it, or you can work out what you can make and find out a really clever way to make people want it. And actually, economically, there's no sensible distinction, just as von Mises said, there's no sensible distinction to be made between what you might call the M part of MR&D and the R&D part of MR&D. Apple, I would argue, is big M, smaller R&D, actually. I mean, the genius of Steve Jobs never really manifested itself in absolute technical superiority in terms of objective measures of clock speed or anything else. It was that he was simply better at producing technology that generated strong positive feelings in the use thereof. And now, bear in mind again, that hostility cropped up. We never believed this, but there were large numbers of tech people at Apple who kind of despised him for this. They go, I don't even understand what Steve does, and he can't even code. And yet, his extraordinary, actually a combination of quite extraordinary factors, I mean, an extraordinary design sense, insane perfectionism, and a really weird phobia, by the way, which is he had compunophobia, which is fear of buttons. If you look at him on stage, you'll basically never see any visible buttons on his clothing. And so there is a theory that says that actually his weird design philosophy, in other words, his hatred for a keyboard, anything that was wiggly and moved, and the creation of things which were solid tablet-like things, was partly driven by exactly that weird phobia. And so, I actually think that one of the things you have to ask is that of all the great ideas that fail, and there are a lot of them, sometimes they're too early, sometimes they're too late, probably more very good tech ideas fail or succeed because of psychological factors than because of technological ones. And there's some really interesting stories of this. Now, we don't know, because of course we don't know the parallel universe in which something different happened. One of the most extraordinary ones was when Marita invented the Walkman. He put in a brief saying, I basically want a cassette player that has enough battery life so I can listen to a full-length opera on a flight from Tokyo to Los Angeles. And the engineers came back and they based the platform for the Walkman on a dictaphone. And they said, and best of all, even though you didn't ask for it in your spec, you could use it to record as well. And Marie said, take the recording function off. They go, but it only adds like $1 to the unit cost. And it doubles the use of the device. You can listen to music and you can record it. Or you can record speech. And Marie said, no, take it off. And they went bonkers, because they're going, you're making it half as useful just to save a trivial amount of money. To be absolutely honest, in the same position, I would have said the same thing. Because it seems logical, doesn't it? What he understood is that if the thing only does one thing, we can decide whether we want it or not a lot more easily than if it does multiple things. And in a sense, it was similar to, I don't know if anybody reads Don Norman, the book, The Design of Everyday Things. His idea of an affordance, that we're naturally actually sometimes happier with things that do less. So that, if you look at good door design, if you're supposed to push, there's a panel. If you're supposed to pull, there's a handle. And every now and then we come across one of those stupid doors where there's a fucking handle that you're supposed to push. And in a sense, a Walkman which also recorded would have been a bit like a door where there was a handle and a panel and it said push. It would have been more. If I don't want a dictaphone, consumers might have thought, am I actually paying half this money for something I don't need? But going back to brands, I think we make another mistake when we talk about added value, which is we also obsess about, because that's our job, if you're generally in branding or brand advertising, the kind of conversation we have about brands tends to be about hair-splitting distinctions between two brands which are very close competitors. Okay, so we never talk about actually brands as brands, the difference between a famous thing and an obscure thing, because generally people who are obscure don't come to us with large budgets to do advertising. So we generally get involved in the competition between two famous brands, and we get involved, I think, in what Freud called the narcissism of small differences. I mean, I actually had a conversation in Ogilvy once where they were actually doing a model casting for Dove. And somebody said, I'm not too keen on the third model. I think her lips are a bit Nivea. And at that point, I'm going, okay, you're starting to lose the plot here. Okay, you're seeing kind of these narrow, tiny brand distinctions. But the real brand distinction that matters in economic terms is the distinction between being a brand and not being one. You know, it's not between these two very, very similar brands in a similar category, which, to be honest, most punters are happy to buy off. Okay, it's the difference between being one of those two and being a nobody. And of course, we never talk about the nobodies. And so, advertising people tend to hear, if only your advertising was just a tiny bit more this, you'd be much more successful. What we never say, which we should be saying, is you need to advertise a lot more because being famous is good. And yet, most of the evidence we actually see about advertising, Jeremy Bullmore made this point, that agencies always say, we can take the budget you have and do it a little bit better. Actually, really honest agencies should be saying, you're not spending nearly enough. But if you go into a new business pitch and say that, you're probably going to lose. So as a result, nobody ever says it, but it's still probably true. And, well, I mean, there's a beautiful film made by Thinkbox. Has anybody seen it? Which shows a world without brands. I'll show it to you now, because I think it is lovely when it just makes this point. But I'll go on even further and say that without brands, capitalism doesn't work, innovation and product improvement doesn't really work, and that one of the major reasons communism failed is because you don't have brands. That sounds a bit weird and bold, but it certainly made communism a bit boring, the fact that you didn't have brands. The fact that you went into a shop and above the door it said, bread, okay? You know, probably made life a little bit dull, because we kind of like making trivial decisions, apart from anything else. But it also made business fundamentally dysfunctional. But let me show you this little world without brands, because I think it's really sweet and lovely. I hope I can, anyway. Here we go. They take a bunch of brands and basically remove all the branding, all the identification.
Hi, so I've got my box with all my products. I'm not excited to use them all really, because although it's things that I use every day, there's less to engage with, it's got less personality. So it'll be interesting to see how it feels to actually replace my usual things with these instead.
Smells. So it doesn't smell like Listerine either, because it hasn't got that kind of like blow your nose off smell. Doesn't hurt. Listerine hurts. It's tingles.
Not sure what I think about that. Don't know if it is strong enough.
I don't look at it and think, that's my tea. I'm just looking at it and thinking, that is tea, rather than my tea that I recognise.
But again, I kind of miss that comfort of having the yellow bottle with the same sort of bottle with the yellow lid and all that. Even though it tastes very similar, there's still like some, I don't know, perhaps something missing from the experience here.
Trying the water from the box. First thoughts are, I don't really trust it because I don't know what's in it. I sort of recognise the shape of the bottle as being from a cheaper brand, so instantly don't feel the same as well when I usually use my own brand, or my usual brand. I mean, obviously it's water and I'm going to need to drink water, and I know I'm going to drink water, but there's definitely something lacking in the experience from my usual experience.
I didn't really want to do either of the tasks, to be honest. Kind of like, I would know that it was a BMW from the outside, a debranded BMW, so to speak, but other people might not. So in a lot of ways you kind of lose that. I don't know if it's a wow factor, but you kind of lose that when people are looking at you and think, oh, he's got, oh, I don't know what colour it is.
So I have just done a wash with the fabric conditioner that I was given, and I can see that I've just taken out the washing and there's barely any smell on the washing at all, which is really disappointing. Definitely a big difference in the one that I currently use and the one that I've just used. And I definitely wouldn't use that one again. The scent wasn't strong enough for me.
When I use the Head and Shoulders, what's happening then is I get this sort of squeaky clean noise like when you clean a glass with a squeegee. And that, God, look at that. And that makes that noise that's clean, that's how you know it's really clean.
Right, this doesn't quite do that. So I don't know why. But I have been using it, and like I said, I'm not overly convinced. I can't really wait to go back to my Head and Shoulders. If you reveal the brand to me, would I change? No.
It's a bit different from my own shampoo, dry shampoo. When I was spraying it, it was like really cold on my scalp, and yeah, it was really cold compared to my usual one. It wasn't as powdery, and I don't think it was as effective as my current one.
So I'm still drinking my water. At this point I'm getting a bit annoyed, just because I don't know what's in it and I don't know what water it is.
It seems to me that it smelled different and it's unlicensable. Stuff you get. Don't take my Head and Shoulders away. I like my Head and Shoulders. Bring it back immediately.
I did feel that I missed an aspect of the brands that I know. I guess it's like missing a friend in a way, because once you've got to know something, then you have a connection with it, and I felt like I didn't really have a connection with the new things because there wasn't a lot to connect with.
Hello, hi there. I really want to go to Aldi, but I'm not going to go. I've just been to Asda and I've been to Lidl again. Some of the products are alright. The broccolis are big, that's all. I'll give Lidl that. The broccolis are very, very big. But on the whole, I just want to go back to Aldi, to be honest. When can I go back to Aldi?
Now, the fascinating thing there, I think it actually, is that they're all exactly the same brand, except for the guy who's forced to go delivered. Every single brand they were using was exactly the same, but it just didn't feel right. Now that actually is a really important, simple part of human psychology, which is, and I'll come on to that in a second. Alfred Korbinski, I think his name is, who was famous for saying the map is not the territory, used to do an experiment with his students, where he'd come in with a lovely bag of biscuits and hand them out to the students in the front row of his lecture hall. And they'd all start munching away really happily, and then he'd pull off the wrapping and reveal they were dog biscuits. At that point, about half the people actually ran out of the room to retch, and one person actually vomited. And he made the point, he said, you see, you do not eat only food, you also eat words. That actually the way we perceive the world is not a separate blind tasting world of taste plus smell plus whatever. We actually, the whole point of our brain is it actually aggregates and fuses information. Moreover, actually, when we perceive something, there's actually more activity going on retrieving memories than there is in actually absorbing new information. Now, if you think about it, it's fairly sensible our brains do work like that for evolutionary reasons, because otherwise, every time we saw a tree, we'd have to work out the fucking thing from first principles, right? Okay? Whereas at the moment, based on our past knowledge of trees, we have a reasonable expectation they're kind of the same shape on the other side that they are this side. And we make a whole load of extrapolations based on past treeners. And that means that nothing is actually objectively perceived. Now, the real reason for this is very simple, it's evolutionary. Robert Trivers, probably the greatest evolutionary biologist, the man we got into Christian Ogilvy Theatre, he said it's a very naive view of evolution, that evolution has given us sensory faculties which over time approximate more and more closely to reality, because evolution doesn't give a shit about accuracy, it cares about fitness. And if it can improve our survival prospects by distorting perception, that's what it's going to do. That's why we're much more sensitive to contrast between colours. I can't go and go, ooh, look, it's Pantone 703, because that's not a very important skill in the wild, generally. You know, being able to say in precise detail what colour the tiger was that ate you, in evolutionary terms, isn't a big high five. It's a failure. Whereas noticing something that isn't quite the same colour as the foliage in which it's hiding, that's really, really important. And so, essentially, our sensory mechanisms are hugely, weirdly deformative. If I've got time, I'll show you a few things later. Not least, by the way, the fact that the colour purple or magenta does not exist in the world. Your brain creates it to make sense of a stimulus that actually, there's no such thing as a magenta photon. Similarly, colour mixing, if you have red and green, if you think about that television, when it shows you red and green but no blue, you see yellow. The only reason that works, it's not because red and green photons when mixed make yellow photons, it's only because the cones in your eyes are of three kinds and they're sensitive to blue, red and green. And when it's seeing equal amounts of red and green but no blue, your brain hypothesizes that what you're detecting are photons that are halfway between red and green, which are yellow. A bird would see something completely different. And by the way, one of the reasons I think that's really, really important is that I think an awful lot of big data, what it will do is it will say, here is the reality, here is the behavior, let us try and map how reality translates into behavior. But if you think about it, if you don't understand perception, that's a really stupid question to ask. Okay? If you don't understand perception or contextual perception, very bluntly put, will people buy a £500 handbag in Aldi? No. Will they buy one on Fifth Avenue? Yes. Now, that's not just that the people on Fifth Avenue are richer than the people in Aldi. The people who shop in Aldi would buy a £500 handbag, but only in Fifth Avenue. Okay? Yeah. The only exception to this rule is airports, where people will buy any end of crack for no reason whatsoever. One consumer tip from someone who's been 30 years in advertising: don't buy anything in an airport. Your judgment goes completely. Okay? But context matters. Now, the reason this matters, if you're not understanding perceptual distortion when you're building your model of thing behaviour, the reason that's a fundamental problem is there were a load of bird experts who literally decided to test bird behaviour by showing birds photographs. But they showed birds photographs which were optimised for humans. Now, a yellow banana to a human may look green to a bird. So they go, that's weird, birds aren't interested in yellow bananas. But actually, of course, what they were showing the bird in reality was an unripe banana. Because that was how the bird interpreted the colour. Obviously, if you showed a real banana, you wouldn't have had that problem necessarily. But what you're showing is a photograph of a banana or a screen picture of a banana. Now, your dog probably thinks your television is shit. Certainly if you've got a parrot, your parrot can't understand why you paid £800 for that total piece of crap thing, which can't even reproduce colours with the basic, realisticness. Now, so one thing we've got to look at with brands is we've got to look at the fact that they're fundamental because actually they affect entirely the way we perceive things. One of the things I did at Ogilvy, by the way, is occasionally, you don't get paid for this. In fact, you don't even get much gratitude. But occasionally telling clients you're doing something bonkers because this whole perceptual thing is so weird. So when Coke, do you remember for a brief period, Coke put red caps on all the Cokes they sold, whether it was Diet, Zero, or what's rudely called Fat Coke, okay? And I said, I cannot believe they're doing that. I mean, it's complete insanity. Because if you've been a regular Diet Coke drinker, anything with a red cap on, even if it's Diet Coke, will taste completely wrong. And what was interesting is, I don't think this was because we told them, but about 2 months later they reversed the whole thing. And my suspicion was that actually Diet Coke sales fell off a cliff. More or less as soon as we opened with Ogilvy, we had a Belgian biscuit manufacturer ring us up and say, we've produced a much lower fat variant of our best-selling biscuit. In blind tastings, everybody loves it, they can't tell the difference. In fact, people really like the taste of the biscuit, everything was positive, and now we've launched it and sales have fallen off a cliff. We said, you didn't put now with less fat on the packaging. We said, well, of course we did. We spent €1 million perfecting this newer, lower fat variant. We said, if you put low fat on anything, it'll taste like shit. I mean, it really is. I mean, by the way, it gets even more extreme than this. If you give regular gin drinkers a gin and tonic and then you follow up with 4 glasses of tonic water where the glass has merely been dipped in gin to create the smell, not only will they not notice, they become pissed. Okay? Cadbury's were bombarded with complaints because people said they'd changed the formulation of their chocolate. All they'd done is, in a sense of fun, is they'd made the blocks of chocolate rounder and smoother. Rounder things taste sweeter than square or lumpier things. It's probably why all those children's lollipops are completely spherical, if you think about it. So that's one way in which branding is essential, because actually it completely affects our perception of the thing we consume. In the same way, by the way, that, the classic example of this is, I don't know if anybody else notices, when you have your car cleaned or even better valeted, it becomes a much better car in every dimension, doesn't it? It's smoother, quieter, it accelerates better, it's got better handling, it's more comfortable. That essentially, what our perception seems to do is just aggregate a load of information from past and present and make some sort of plausible reality from it. But actually, the idea that, that because it's Evian water and you put it in a cheap plastic bottle, it tastes the same, really isn't true. Much more important, possibly part of brands, is if you think about it, this, I think, was a really interesting kind of accidental experiment. Because about 2 or 3 Christmases ago, do you remember these things were kind of like becoming the hot Christmas present? And they've got about 20 different names: duck boards, hoverboards, air boards, whatever. But the interesting thing is they weren't branded, or rather they weren't branded by the manufacturer, they were actually branded by the importer. And importers would just go out to Shenzhen in China, where people would rustle up these things, and they'd buy one that caught their eye, and they give it a silly name and sell it in the box. Now, the problem there was that nobody could make sense of the category at all. Did anybody go and try and buy one of these and end up going, oh, I don't fucking know, right? Which one do I buy? What about the ones with a big wheel? Do I want one with a smaller? Well, I don't know, okay? So, but secondly, none of them had a recognisable brand name, so there was no one selling it with skin in the game who had a reputation to lose by selling a bad one. Now, if you think about it, without clear brands and trademarks, the feedback loop, the kind of Darwinian evolutionary feedback loop of capitalism can't work. Because capitalism works not because it's efficient, that's an economic myth. Capitalism is remotely efficient. Competition is usually, in the short to medium term, very, very wasteful. There are far too many shops selling us shit. What Mao would have done is he would have had, instead of 9 different supermarkets where I live in my hometown, he would have had the great grocery hall of the people that were 2009, right? And it would have been much more efficient, but after about 6 months, it would have become crap because of the lack of available alternatives. And that when you don't have competition and comparison, there isn't a mechanism by which things can improve. When you don't have a recognisable brand, no one can reward the good ones and no one can punish the bad ones. And when someone produces a bad one, which they did, the whole category gets infected. So what actually happened before Christmas is 2 of these, which wasn't massive in the scheme of things, 2 of them caught fire while charging. In one case, setting fire to a Christmas tree. Does anybody remember those? All over the news. Let's face it, there isn't much news before Christmas. So, a hoverboard catching fire is pretty much, outside broadcast territory at that point. What happened? Did we get a message saying, do not buy the Ouija 207964? No, we didn't. We just didn't buy any of them because we didn't know which one to avoid. So the whole punish and reward mechanism, which means that capitalism, or to give it a more accurate name, kind of consumer-tested innovation, which is what it really is, that feedback mechanism doesn't work unless there's an efficient means of eradicating the worst and rewarding the best. Likewise, there's no incentive for you to improve your particular board because, again, the gains will just disperse to the whole category, if at all. And even with the internet, which you would have thought would have solved that problem, or a lot of economists would have said that, basically, as soon as one caught fire, people thought, okay, I'll go and get something else instead. So I always thought that was a really interesting experiment. The other experiment I love is a case where I always wanted to prove that von Mises point by finding a fantastic product being sold really terribly. To make the point that actually it isn't added value, it's multiplied value. And it doesn't matter how good your product is, if you market in a way that doesn't inspire trust, that isn't plausible, that doesn't make sense, nobody will buy. I thought, well, nobody's going to do that. Nobody's going to develop a great product and then try and sell it terribly. Until I discovered 2 Melbourne comedians who did exactly that. Has anybody seen this? It's a joy. Here we go.
Hello. Hi. Whee! Peep shows. They have a pretty bad name, normally associated with lewd content, but by definition, they don't have to be.
So in an attempt to change that, we took one of the world's biggest performing artists, kept all his clothes on, and set up an Ed Sheeran peep show. Would anyone dare to believe what was written outside and come into our very dodgy looking venue?
How are you feeling?
I don't really know what's going on.
That was fair enough, because we dressed Hamish as a fairly shady looking spruiker in charge of getting customers.
I got you Sheeran. Who wasn't Sheeran?
Alright, I can hear Hamish.
Do you think I get anyone?
I don't think we'll get anyone. It's going to be a brave soul.
I wouldn't come into, if there was a dude with a beard with a hat and saying like come in and see this.
Ed was right. This was going to be tough.
You want to peep at Ed Sheeran for $2? Insurance. Do you want to peep at Ed Sheeran? You're lost. What do you reckon, big fella? Got Ed Sheeran in here. Beautiful ginger haired man. Sitting on a stool. What do you reckon? $2. Got Ed Sheeran just sitting on a stool in there. You want him? $2. $2 for a peep. Think about it. It's actually pretty good value.
Despite trying, we had a total lack of interest for over 50 minutes. It's been some time. We should have got you a more comfy chair, I think.
Yeah, I'm alright.
Hey, big fella, got all the Sheeran you need in there, $2.
What is it?
All the Ed Sheeran you need.
What?
Ed Sheeran.
Oh, I don't know what that is.
He's a singer. Yeah? Is that a yes? No? I think one of the big problems is people think Ed Sheeran's a code word for a new drug. Has got you guys like Ed Sheeran? $2. $2 for a 30-second peep.
What, like, are they just saying no?
Yeah.
Category.
Dirt sheet peep. Dirt sheet peep. Here we go, $2.
Do you reckon we're pricing it too high, and that's why we're not getting people coming in?
I think $2 is pretty fair.
There we go, boys. It's a Friday. Get you Ed Sheeran peep show. $2. Sitting on a stool, play your song.
If someone actually does think it's a peep show, and I quickly give you the go-ahead to take off all your clothes, are you willing to do that?
I've been drinking a lot of beer recently.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
You're not?
A couple of months ago, maybe, but
Yeah.
yeah, I'm in shape. It's just the shape of the potato.
2 hours in, and Hamish was getting more desperate.
Ed Sheeran is literally sitting in there on the stage waiting for your $2.
We were feeling it as well, but just when we thought this had been a giant waste of everyone's time.
You guys like Ed Sheeran? You love Ed Sheeran? $2? Peep show. Just got him sitting on stage in there. Oh, $2. It's gonna cost you $2. You only get 30 seconds though. You okay? Hey? Well, there's only one way to find out.
We might be on here.
Here we go. Ed Sheeran peep show. He's there till midday. Alright, your choice.
No, she did the smart thing and walked away.
Listen, if you guys want, I'm just saying, if you guys want to have to go, he's sitting there by himself, it'll probably get busy later on. $2, 30 seconds. I mean, you both can come if you want, just $2 a head. Everything's above board, I can assure you. No, absolutely not. Like, I can't guarantee what Ed will do, but yeah, it's paying you $2.
And after 2 hours and 23 minutes, including some final hesitation, we finally found people brave enough to take a peep.
Did you guys go to peep shows a lot, or?
No. There you go, mate.
Keep your clothes on, stay on the seat. Behave yourselves. Just listen to the announcement. Have a good one. Enjoy your peep.
Hello and welcome to the peep show. Your time will start in 5 seconds.
Let's give this a go.
Oh, it's the night. Till we're 17. Baby, my heart still wide. Heart 23. And I'm thinking about how people fall in love.
Your time is finished.
It's a perfect experiment because if that seems silly, that's pretty much how it feels, I think, to be a financial services brand at the moment. In other words, it doesn't matter how good your product is, basically people don't trust you. You know, and no one's done anything yet radical enough, I think, to solve that fundamental problem. which is why a lot of financial services products have to be sold. Now, interestingly, by the way, when he finally got that couple to use it, to go in, he used 2 or 3 really well-known techniques of behavioural science, scarcity bias. He said, he's only going to be there till midday, it's going to get pretty busy later on, etc. You both can come in if you like. Notice also, by the way, that someone suggested that the solution to the problem, remember what I said earlier about the food and the man who sweeps the floor? Someone actually said, maybe we're pricing it too high, which is the standard rational solution to a product not selling. And there's a really weird bias in business, which is if you suggest something that's consonant with standard economic theory, the burden of proof you face is very, very small. If you suggest something if you propose alchemy, and by the way, sometimes putting the price up can increase demand, quite often, in fact. It's happened with one, off the record, whiskey brand, Jameson's been in Tony. Okay, they basically found that they thought, well, everybody else is a Scotch whiskey, we're an Irish whiskey, therefore we've got to be cheaper because it's different. And they said, hold on, let's reverse that logic, make it £1 more expensive rather than £1 cheaper, sales rocketed. Now, economists get really angry and upset when you tell them this. But if you think about it, think of that the way the human brain works, actually, the thing being £1 more expensive completely changes your whole perception of the thing, doesn't it? It's different because it's better versus it's different because it's cheaper. They're totally different perceptions. Now, I think it's a really interesting thing as well, when we talk about these hair-splitting distinctions between brands, which I think brand companies tend to get engaged in, I don't think it's helpful because I think it hugely undervalues what brands really do, which is they make it easy for you to buy. Now, you can imagine that if you'd had the right setting, the right promotion, what could you have charged for a 30-second Ed Sheeran and so on? Well, you could have probably charged, there would have been people in Melbourne who would have paid $5,000 for that. Probably. Not many, but a few, okay? That's what I mean about the difference that marketing and context makes. And so I think we're always talking about these tiny little sort of, narcissistic differences between brands, the real differences between being a brand and not being one. This was David Ogilvy's favourite ever business-to-business ad for McGraw-Hill business advertising. And it makes a brilliant point. I don't know who you are, I don't know who your company is. Now, there are all these questions. Whenever we buy something, our brain is filled with loads of questions. Am I doing the right thing? Is there something better? What about this? What about that? The really significant thing about brands is they answer those questions before we've even had to ask them. If something's familiar enough, if something's popular enough, widely popular enough, familiar enough, we don't even ask the questions in the first place. So this model, I think, of the neuroscience model of advertising where, we've got this little Amazon place in our brain, our little Sony place in the brain, which is slightly different from the Samsung place in our brain, I think is missing the major point of actually what brands do, which is completely the opposite of that, actually. If you look at neuroscience measures of brain activity, when people are buying brands and when people are buying obscure products, what you see when people are buying brands is much less activity, not more. Because you can buy a brand without having to think about it all that much. Because it's going to be okay. And I'll explain what okay means later on. It's really important. Doesn't mean it's the best thing in the world, but it's going to be okay. And so, in many ways, the value of a brand isn't all those things that you're storing in your brain about, kind, gentle, etc. The main value of a brand is actually all those questions you no longer need to ask, because the brand's kind of answered them for you by being a famous brand. Now, what is fascinating about what I've done over the last 15 years, I suppose, in looking at behavioural science in marketing and advertising, is that I went all around the houses meeting extraordinary people, mathematicians, psychologists, behavioural economists. And what I discovered is that, unbeknownst to me, the guy who'd got it most right was a colleague of David Ogilvy's in about 1960, late 50s, early 60s. I met him in Chicago. He's still alive, called Joel Raffleson. He's in his 80s, although to talk to him, you'd think he was about 40. He and his wife both worked as copywriters with David Ogilvy, literally in the Mad Men era. And I asked him, was it, the drinking and the general philandering, was it really like that? Of course not, he said, it's a monstrous exaggeration. I don't know how they got away with it. And then his wife piped up and said, darling, he said, it was exactly like that. So she clearly remembered it as being a bit more Mad Men-y than he did. But He asked a question, David Ogilvy, which I think is one of the most interesting questions ever asked, and David basically agreed with it. Now bear in mind, this is 1950, let's say it was 58, 60, around the same time that Herbert Simon was getting a Nobel Prize for his work on decision-making under uncertainty. Okay, so this is quite a sophisticated question to ask. Joel's extraordinary guy, by the way. He's called, as I said, Joel Raffleson. His dad was Samson Raffleson, who was the scriptwriter for The Jazz Singer and all the Lubitsch films, like Heaven Can Wait. So his dad was kind of Hollywood royalty, and he was a copywriter. So quite a common pattern in the ad industry, actually, in the sense that, Dylan Thomas's son worked for J. Walter Thompson and so on. And he asked the question to David Ogilvy. He said, here's my theory. He said, what do you think? He said, I think people choose brand B rather than brand A, not because they think brand B is better, but because they're more certain that it's good. Now that again seems like a small distinction. I think it captures very well why we pay a premium for brands, which is we're not necessarily thinking that the Samsung television that costs $150 more than the television by some weird manufacturer we've hardly heard of. I don't think we're thinking it's $150 better. I don't think we're paying actually for the expectation of average superiority. I think we're paying for the minimization of downside risk. The Samsung television is, maybe it's a little bit better, maybe it's just the same. What's different and what's worth $150 is the reduction in our fear that it might be a total crock of shit. In some ways, I had a meal with Nassim Taleb about this, and he drew true graphs on a napkin, which I stupidly didn't keep, and it's the difference between a Michelin-starred restaurant and McDonald's. Michelin-starred restaurant has a very, very high average food quality. Actually, it has quite a large downside risk of if you think about it, the worst case of E. coli in a British restaurant was in the fat duck of bread, right? Fair point, okay. The number of times I've had the shits after eating in a fancy restaurant far outnumbers the number of times I've had the shits after eating in McDonald's, right? Fair? That's why I get annoyed about Terminal 5, by the way. I'm about to sit on a bloody plane in a pressurised metal cylinder for 9 hours, and they've got the seafood and caviar restaurant. That's a great thing. In fact, why don't I just have some oysters before I board the plane? Okay, so it's got so up its own arse, Terminal 5, with fucking luxury goods bollocks. I want the golden arches. I'm going to be on a plane for 9 hours. I don't really want a fantastic culinary experience. I just don't want to be ill, right? And Nassim drew this thing, which is the trade-off, basically, between average expectation and variance. And a lot of people look at a decision as if it's like this. It's very neat. Now, here, there is no difference between bias and variance. And there's no debate about what your strategy is in archery, which is you aim for the bullseye. Okay? Because you aim for the bullseye, it cannot be a bad decision, because if you aim for it, if you just miss the 10, you get a 9. If you miss the 9, you get an 8. If you miss the 8, you get a 7. Miss the 7, you get a 6. Now, that very simplicity of the scoring system in archery may explain why it's never made it as a popular televised sport. Because if you can imagine what it's like to be an archery commentator, right? So, what do you think he's going to do now, Dave? I think he's going to aim for the bullseye like he has on all 4,000 previous fucking occasions, right? By contrast, darts, okay, I'm so glad to have a British audience, because occasionally I make this presentation in France, and it's just met with complete bafflement. It's certainly like the French, not a great darting nation. Okay? Now, this is a much more interesting sport, because there's a trade-off between bias and variance. So actually, if you're not very good, now everybody always aims for triple 20 because they want to pretend they're Phil the Power Taylor, okay? And you get thrown out of your darts club if you don't do that. Actually, if you're not very good, or if you're drunk, possibly both together, or if it's windy, or the board's moving, or you've got bad eyesight, you actually aim for the southwestern quadrant of the board. Because although it's less optimal, you won't get 60, you won't get 1 or 5 either. And so darts is actually a much more subtle sport in a sense. Because you have to consider not just the difference between aiming for the best and avoiding the worst. Unlike archery, it's not one and the same thing. And what this is called, now you discovered this about a month ago, what in some ways Joel Raffleson was talking about to David Ogilvy, is what's known in statistics as the bias-variance trade-off. And there are many, many decisions we have to make a call between, okay, do I want to sacrifice a bit of perception or a bit of value for money? In other words, bias. In other words, I'm paying slightly more for this TV than I would normally in order to minimize the spread of possible outcomes. Now, I would argue when you buy a Samsung television rather than a weird television, what you are reassured by is basically the idea that whatever the Samsung television is going to be like, and to be honest, you probably are paying a bit more for it than you need to, but what you're paying for is variance reduction, not necessarily quality optimization. I don't think economics, because it assumes perfect information and perfect trust, economics is completely blind to that. Now, by the way, you could apply that to getting married, right? There's a certain amount, this is terribly unromantic, I hope my wife doesn't see this film. There's a certain amount of, I want someone I can love, cherish, great relationships, fantastic chemistry, but there's also a certain amount of definitely not a loony, right? Okay? And I think you can prove that actually in romantic relationships, in that there are certain things you can do which basically kill romantic interest dead. Fair? There's certain behaviours which the opposite sex in either direction would just go, whoa, right? Okay? Deal breakers, in other words. With one colleague of mine, strangely, it was turning up to a date wearing a hat. I thought that was a bit extreme, you don't think? But for some reason, basically, turns up wearing a hat, all bet. Now, so you can explain marriage looking at the bias-variance trade-off. You can explain brands using the bias-variance trade-off. And you can also explain lots and lots of consumer behaviours this way. So we worked with Diageo, and one of the things we said is, look, there is no way you'll ever get blokes to order cocktails in a bar unless the menu shows a photograph or a drawing of the glass in which it's going to be served. Because if the male brain thinks there's a 0.5% chance it'll arrive looking like this, doesn't matter how much he likes the contents, he'll order a beer instead. Because the downside risk is too great. So we had extraordinary success. But now, a brilliant way around that, by the way, is the business of selling cocktails but serving them all in mason jars. The weirdest thing, as I told Diageo the other day, when you think about it, the stupidest drink glass combination in the world is the bloody martini. Because it's a hardcore drink, right? I mean, it's basically neat spirit, and yet you serve it in a glass in which, essentially, unless you're auditioning for the next James Bond film, no bloke would feel comfortable standing at the bar holding that thing. So serving martinis in mason jars, anything. Shoes would be better, to be honest. So you have this extraordinary case where, and it also explains why nobody moves their current account. It's not because it's not a good idea on average, it's because the worst that can happen is really quite bad. The variance is still quite high, even if the average outcome is beneficial. So why do we think that brands and reputation guarantee low variance? And here we get into, I suppose, there's a book by Nassim Taleb, Skin in the Game. If you've spent a huge amount of money, unrecoverably, up front, to establish fame and a reputation, and it's taken you 10 years, or in case of Samsung, 20, 30 years maybe, to build up a reputation where it's probably fair to say Samsung, LG and Sony are now on a par. Is that right? If you're buying a telly? Okay, you'd be kind of equally cool with all of them. Now that's probably taken Samsung and LG, which are Korean, as opposed to Sony, which is Japanese, probably taken them 20 years and, $40 billion to achieve that parity? Okay? You've got much more to lose from selling a bad product than someone who started their business yesterday. And it's effectively sunk cost as skin in the game. The extent to which you're actually playing the long game, bear in mind in game theory, if you're playing the repeat game, in other words, we're in business for a long time, it pays to be honest, because you get repeat business. If you're playing the short game, we just want to rip everybody off once, it pays to cheat. That's why tourist restaurants, at least until TripAdvisor, were terrible places to eat. Because they had no intention of anybody coming back, because all the customers are going to be flying back to Luton in 2 days anyway, right? So the best thing you can do is serve them a meal that was as overpriced as possible and just hope they survived long enough to pay the bill. That was tourist restaurant strategy. Whereas if you're a local pub and you rely entirely on repeat custom, you've got to be a reasonable pub, because otherwise you're out of business. Now, one way you can demonstrate that you're playing the long repeat game rather than the short one-off game is by spending a lot of money up front. Because spending a lot of money up front only pays if you're planning to be in business a long time. Because otherwise you wouldn't be around long enough to recoup the gains over repeated iterations. Now, okay, let's move this away from game theory and theoretical stuff about commitment devices. Let's look at what happens when people get engaged or married. You want the guy to give an honest signal that he's in this relationship for the long term. Because women have to bring up the child, okay, the cost of childbearing and childcare to some extent will disproportionately fall on them. The worst thing you can have is a guy who then basically, and it is a male reproductive strategy, which is get someone pregnant and disappear, right? So what you've got to do is see from him that he has at least honest long-term intentions towards the relationship. So you get him to buy you something really fucking expensive with no resale value. That's what you do. Okay? And you'll notice, by the way, that however rich the guy is, whatever he spends on this has got to hurt. You know, there's no ceiling where Rupert Murdoch can go, look, I think $3,000 is fine because anything else will be vulgar. It's got to hurt Rupert, right? In order to be a sincere... One of the reasons, by the way, I don't think social media and digital media, I think they work very well for small brands. I'm dubious about how well they work for large brands because the cost of social and digital media is often too low to hurt. So it's not really an honest display of commitment. By the way, another interesting fact about this, women particularly like being given jewellery and flowers by men, partly because men aren't remotely interested in jewellery and flowers. So if you think about it, it's a display of generosity where there is no suspicion of self-interest. Fair? Okay? Now, by contrast, if you buy your girlfriend a quad bike or a drone for or something I nearly did, which is give her your old iPad so you can buy the latest one. Now, really, okay, there is a strong suspicion that you're not really behaving altruistically. And so it's not a powerful commitment device as a result. So I would argue there is a role to expensive media and expensive brand building activities because they prove something about the sincere intentions of the person selling and manufacturing the product in a way that cheap things don't. There's also a further argument, which I should make, which is that mass media may be more convincing because they're not targeted. Does that sound a bit weird? Okay, so we inherently trust messages that are made in a mass media setting more than we do messages which are made in a discrete, highly targeted setting. When you get married, you don't go door to door making your wedding vows. You get everybody you know and who knows you, you get them together in one place, and you make the promises simultaneously to everybody who's present. Now, one reason why that's much more trustworthy is, of course, it only takes one person to go, but he's already married, okay? And everybody knows. If you make the promises one person at a time, the audience, if you like, aren't interconnected. And so trust is comparatively weaker. Now, if you think about it, why was banking so trustworthy in the UK in the Captain Mannering era, in the era of Dad's Army and Captain Mannering? Because Captain Mannering was a pillar of the local community as the bank manager. He was known to all his customers knew him, but equally important, all his customers knew each other. So he knew, if you ran a bank branch in a provincial British town in the 1950s, you only had to get caught out ripping off one pensioner on their home contents insurance, and your reputation in the town risked being total toast. You're finished. And so the interconnectedness of a target audience, but also the indiscriminateness with which a message is made, contributes to trust. And there's an extraordinary thing I may be able to show here, if I can. Let's see if I can. Are we mirroring the screen? Here's the Chrome thing, is it? Yeah. Watch this. Okay, I'll refresh this. Now, what you're seeing here, before I refresh it, the green lines are honest advertisers. Oh, it's not showing. Oh, do you know how to make it? Yeah, sorry about this. We can do this. It's fantastic. This is, by the way, an expensive signal in nature. It basically says, I must be really fit because I can afford to do all this shit for purely decorative purposes. Okay? And So if you just go onto Mirror, is it? Or let's see if we can do it. Yeah, here we are. And if you pop up Chrome, there we are, fantastic. Now, the green lines are messages generated by honest advertisers. The red lines are messages generated by dishonest advertisers. Every time they find a punter, okay, they make a sale. And the dishonest advertisers actually make more because their product's not as good as the honest advertiser's product in this model, okay? However, there are scattered amongst the audience blue dots. And these people are called norm enforcers. These are people who will punish dishonest advertisers for communicating to them. And they're only a small part of the population. What you see here, and what you'll see, every one of these is a fresh iteration. What you see here, when we start off afresh, is it starts off highly dishonest. The blue lines are when a norm enforcer punishes a dishonest, i.e. red advertiser. Okay? The green lines are the honest advertisers. And what happens over time is you'll see that there are honest and dishonest short-range advertisers, i.e. with very short lines, that's targeted advertisers, but there are only honest long-range advertisers. So soon you'll start to see that the long lines tend to be green. It may take a bit of a wait, and we may have to come back to this and look at the end of the presentation because the processor is a bit slow on this machine. But you'll start, no, it's actually happening reasonably quickly. Now what that means is that he put it in very simple terms, okay? This is a guy called Don Marty at Mozilla who developed this model. And as you can see, it started off mostly red because they were making more money by lying. It's now started to become where the red advertisers are highly targeted. They're just dealing with people a very short distance away from them. It nearly always works, this, every time I run it. Once or twice it's got a bit funny. Whereas the honest advertisers are talking to everybody. So a reasonable inference from this is if someone's talking to loads of people over a long range, he's probably green. And if someone's talking over a short range, there's a fair chance he's red. In the same way, someone who advertises on ITV is more trustworthy than someone who advertises in a digital ad on Facebook, which as far as you know, has only been seen by you and nobody else. This is why political digital advertising is so dangerous, because you can lie to some of the people some of the time. Whereas you put an ad in the Telegraph, you're basically holding it up to the judgment of, like, the wedding crowd. It only takes one person to go, but he's already married, okay? And everybody knows. And this seems to be an incredibly important point because it's not understood at all by people who are just trying to make advertising more efficient. So if I can go back to, is it possible to go back to the, here we go, yeah, oh my goodness. And then I press this funny thing down here, don't I? Or has it moved up to the top again? No, down here again, isn't it? Oh, it's here, isn't it? There.
No.
Why they make the most important button on the screen unbelievably small? Never mind. Okay, so we've got to wait again, have we? Okay, right. So I'll sit down. But that seems really, really interesting because it wouldn't surprise me if humans had evolved this instinct perfectly well over time. But essentially, people who make a promise indiscriminately. Now, the way Don Marty from Mozilla, who developed the model, explained it to me, he said, look, I don't know that much about woodworking, but I subscribe to a magazine called Practical Woodworking, and I believe the ads in Practical Woodworking because when an ad goes into Practical Woodworking, it isn't only seen by me, it's also seen by 100 Americans who know more about woodworking than anybody else on the planet. And if the ad's bollocks, they're going to ring up Practical Woodworking and say, that's crap, you shouldn't run that ad again. If you run an ad on Facebook, probably no human has ever seen it apart from you, for all you know. So the opportunity for norm enforcement is basically nil. Now, the problem we have, how long have I got? Because I'm conscious of that. Ooh. What, 5 minutes?
And then some questions.
Okay, right. Okay, so I'll end early. The problem we have is that Silicon Valley doesn't understand any of this. Silicon Valley is dominated by engineers, and they are obsessed with efficiency. In fact, what Silicon Valley is most obsessed with is engineering out the human. So removing human intervention, instinct, and everything else from practically every decision that's made and replacing it with an algorithm. Okay? They don't really understand meaning or what things are for either. So when I was down in Menlo Park, you're not going to believe this, okay? There are little petrol tankers driving around. Menlo Park, driving around, actually pretty much the whole of the Silicon Valley area. And they continued driving to the car parks. And I said to my guy, what the fuck are they for? He said, oh, they fill your car with petrol while you're at work. What? But, okay, I was kind of going, first of all, okay, that saves 2 minutes, okay? Secondly, the kind of people who think that's a good idea have turned their life into a time optimization problem, which is stupid. Thirdly, okay, the point of a BP station isn't really, stopping the BP station, isn't really that it's a place where you fill up with petrol. It's actually a place where you buy an M&S pork pie without your wife finding out. Okay? But I mean, think about it. When was the last time you actually stopped for petrol without buying something else? So, oh shit, we run out of milk. So all those people are having their little petrol tank filled up by the little tanker, the Uber of gasoline, as it's called, okay? And they're probably going home and going, oh shit, I've run out of milk, and they're stopping anyway. Now, what I call the valley vice is where you take something that exists, a doorman in a hotel, and you define the doorman's role incredibly narrowly. You go, the purpose of a doorman is to... Now, the first thing to realise, this is actually in Nassim Taleb's book, I'm flattered to say. Okay, nearly everything we buy isn't really a thing. There's no such thing as a thing. Things have a meaning and a use and a context, but what are things for isn't really what we think it's for. So, 2 examples, okay. The value of a dishwasher isn't really that it washes plates and knives. It's that it gives you a place to keep dirty plates and knives out of sight. Okay? When you think about it in depth, that's the real value. Okay? Washing up plates is a bit annoying, not nearly as annoying as having to look at dirty plates for 9 hours, right? Similarly, the value of having a swimming pool in your garden isn't really that you swim in it. It's that you're now allowed to walk around your garden in a bathing costume without feeling like a dick. So lots of things have a value, which isn't really what they're about. Now, a hotel doorman is called a doorman. He's not really there to open the door. That's been automated years ago, you know. So what Silicon Valley will do is they'll fire the doorman, point to the amazing savings they've made by firing the doorman, and replace him with an automatic door. And they'll say, look at the amazing cost savings. We've made this more efficient by the use of technology and automation. The problem is the doorman actually performs about 9 functions. You know, it's recognition, security, status. You can only charge so much for a hotel if you haven't got a doorman. It's, basically, keeping undesirables away. It's recognizing regular customers. It's carrying your luggage. Okay? And so what they tend to do is they replace something with what is a more efficient version of 10% of what the original thing did. And I think they've done it in advertising. I think they've taken what advertising did, and to some extent, when they're doing direct marketing work, they haven't done it that badly, because they've actually produced a more efficient version of direct marketing, which may be a worthwhile exercise. And we need direct marketing because it's part of marketing. Okay? But in the brand building question, they've looked at it as if it's all about the efficient delivery of messages to a minimally sized audience, one person at a time, at the lowest possible cost. Whereas the creation of trust requires the generation of expensive, costly messages which are distributed to a large and indiscriminate audience simultaneously. And the difference they haven't understood is the difference between messaging and signalling. Okay? Messaging is where you completely trust what the sender's sending you. And that's a logistics problem. Do you use a fax? Do you use an email? If you completely trust the message of the other party, then messaging isn't a totally terrible approach. In the case of advertising, where you actually have to establish a brand reputation, efficiency is actually the enemy of trust. Just as, if someone had a really efficient wedding, where the ring was made out of metal and, the invitations were sent out by email, right? It wouldn't be doing the job of a wedding. You could send out the invitations by email, by the way, but it would have to be really creative. It's an interesting way of looking at it. When you want a message to be convincing, it's got to be costly, but that doesn't mean costly in financial terms. It has to require something which is scarce or difficult. Bravery, humour, poetry, artistry, music. So if you've got no money and you want to have a great wedding invitation, but you haven't got the money for all that gilt shit, first-class stamps, okay, don't try and do the conventional thing on the cheap. Not a good idea to send a wedding invitation out, for example, with your company's franking machine thing on it. That's not a good sign, right? But what you could do is you could compose a song about your wedding that was a pretty good song, post it on YouTube, and invite your guests to look at it. because that's difficult to do. It shows effort. But if you make a wedding invitation by email, it's really, really funny. That's clever. So creativity and media costs are in some ways kind of multipliers. They're all part of the effort you put in to the message to demonstrate your sincere belief in what it says. It can just be money. So if you think about it, if you've got a friend who owns a racehorse, and you say, do you think your racehorse is going to win on Saturday? And he goes, yes. That's totally meaningless, right? Because everybody says that. If he says, come with me, takes you to the bookies, and you see him put £5,000 on his own horse, well, any betting man would know that's highly relevant information, because he's now got skin in the game. And a brand is a manufacturer's skin in the game. And actually a brand's a double-edged sword, because if you fail to live up to your promise, you're punished doubly. If you do keep to your promise, you're rewarded by being able to charge the brand premium. And it effectively says, I'm engaging in this high dudgeon form of reputational capitalism where I have something to gain but a lot to lose. And the people who are engaging in that form of capitalism are inherently more trustworthy than the people who aren't. A flower is signalling, it's not messaging. It's a weed with an advertising budget. Okay? But it partly says, the bees can be fairly confident that I will have a reliable source of nectar ongoing, because if I wasn't going to be around for a long time supplying nectar, I wouldn't have invested in all these costly petals. Okay? So that's my big worry. And I think I'm going to end here, except by saying one more thing. That we have a business culture which absolutely prizes logic. If you're logical, you'll never get fired, you'll never get into trouble, whatever the outcome is, because you've used logic. So everybody basically in business is trying to test, will only test the things that they can post-rationalize in retrospect. Because what people are looking for in business, consumers basically when they make a decision are trying to minimize regret. Business people and bureaucrats are trying to minimize the risk of blame. And it's a very different thing. And when you're making a decision, what you do is you look desperately for any model that will mean that in the event of failure, the blame people aren't going to come looking at you. And so what you do is you do very boring, logical things. And so I want you to imagine, just at the end, when we're talking about brands, okay? I haven't got the right picture here. Imagine we're talking about brands here. What is, okay, you want to compete with Coca-Cola. For 150 years, it's been the most popular cold, non-alcoholic drink in the world. And you sit down in a room and you go, well, it's perfectly simple. Nobody will question this. And in fact, if you do this and fail, you won't get fired. So we need a drink that tastes nicer than Coke, costs less than Coke, and comes in a really big can so people get great value for money. That's right. Because if it's consonant with economic theory, you never get into any trouble for espousing. And what's the problem with that reasoning? Sounds fantastic, doesn't it? The only problem is this. The most successful attempt to compete with Coca-Cola in 150 years is Red Bull. It tastes disgusting, costs a fortune, and comes in a tiny can. So at that point, one of the things we have to try and break out of is this business where, in an attempt for business to look logical, it's cleaving to a form of economic science, which is very, very good for defending your decisions, but is actually leading to a kind of cowardice in terms of the decision people make. Because that's kind of bad for business, and it's bad for brands. Thanks very much indeed.